guys, UnoPro here with my monthly card review for August. Now we have some really interesting cards today, so let's go ahead and get straight into things. Now this month's theme is basically damaging your own general or your general taking damage. So our first card is kind of an activator for this, plus just an all-round pretty interesting card. So it's called Blistering Scorn. It's a 3 mana 3/4. But it's basically never going to be a 3 mana 3/4. It's going to be a 3/3 most of the time because it does 1 damage to everything, including itself when it comes in. So 3 mana 3/3 that does 1 damage to everything, including the generals. So definitely the synergy with some of the later cards, but more want to talk about how it serves as kind of an AoE card and when it can work. So I think this card is actually pretty powerful. Those of you familiar with Hearthstone will know Ravaging Ghoul is a very similar card. Obviously different games, but pretty powerful card there. I think in Duelyst it will serve a similar function. However, it will be less about, I think it'll be more about decks that won't really have the downside of this, because you never want to be doing this when you're having your own 3 health boards. So some of the more defensive decks may want this, and it's also just a medical. It's going to be pretty good against aggro, pretty good against 2/3s, just because you can trade it with your general when it's left as a 2/2. So some of the more defensive decks, and I think there's also a little bit of Zaran synergy. I've been saying for a while now that the problem with Zaran isn't really that you don't have enough to benefit when you heal. Like, we keep getting new healing cards revealed and new ones have come in, but it's just, that's not really the problem. I think the problem is getting activators, like just having situations where you can actually use your Bloodborne spell. And this is a card that does it. Turn 4, Blistering Scorn, heal a dude isn't the worst play in the world. So that's definitely something to look out for, and kind of cements Lina or Zaran as like an anti-aggro kind of tool, which is definitely something that has a place in some certain metagames. So it's an interesting card. It is an open gambit minion, so you look at Kara, but probably not what Kara wants to be doing. Kind of works well against Kara to an extent. Songhais that are very spell-based may want this, but Reaver tends to be the go-to general, and this card is obviously a no-no with Reaver. So maybe some kind of Kalios very spell-based builds where you're going to get a lot of one-sided benefits, or really just any kind of thing. Expecting probably Venar. Well, so since we talked, Kara probably doesn't want this unless it's more late-game Kara. Probably Faye can use this pretty well if you're not running the walls builds. So it kind of shores up a weakness of Venar and Vitruvian to Jack's True Sight, but at the same time you want to be running those cards yourself. So if we do see builds that don't really get destroyed by this card, they may want to run it, because that's one of the problems with Venar, that really doesn't have a good answer to swarm kind of strategies, or Jack's True Sight. So Lilith, Jack's True Sight, having an answer is always really nice, and basically I just love the fact that we have a neutral card to Jack's True Sight. Recently it hasn't been that much of a problem due to how the meta has been, but back in the past, like when Venar and Vitruvian were the top 2 factions, I played in the Spring Championship, and literally every game was basically decided by who played Jack's True Sight first, because everyone was playing Venar, everyone was playing Vitruvian, and you just have no answers to that. So glad there's a neutral. I don't know how much play this will see on the ladder. It will really depend on the meta, but it's nice to have these options, these soft tech cards as well. So really like this card, and then maybe you'll see some playing with the self-damaging general ones, but I think it's more of just an anti-aggro card in general, or anti-swarm. Anyway, let's go on to the next card, and that is a bit of an interesting one. This one, I'll be honest, it's one of the harder ones to evaluate for sure. So it's a 5 mana 5/5 that costs 2 less if your general took damage on your opponent's last turn. So you're looking at a 3 mana 5/5 when it goes off. But one of the problems is when you want 3 mana cards is when you're going second on your first turn, and unless your opponent blood tears you in the face, you're not going to be able to play it. So that's a little bit of a problem with the card. So it really depends just how often this is going to get procced. And there's not really many ways to proc it. Is there anything to proc it on your opponent's turn to make sure they damage you? Probably not. There might be one thing or so, but anyway, it's good against aggro, obviously, so that's kind of a bit of a theme of these 2 cards here, is they're good against aggro. because it just kind of dissuades your opponent from hitting it. Though it also has a kind of self-limiting factor on how prominent it can really be, unless it turns out to be super powerful, because once this card starts seeing a lot of play, then people will start playing around it a lot, and then stuck with a 5/5 for 5 in hand doesn't seem that good. And if you're playing it late game, well, sure, it's a 3 mana 5/5, but late game that's not the biggest impact thing. I do think this card is actually pretty good though. 3 mana 5/5 is still good for most of the game. I think it definitely has some Kara synergy. Obviously Kara, bring some more late game Karas just because you're often the aggressor, so often your opponent doesn't want to attack you, but Kara does get rushed down fairly early, and then mid game you're on 6 or 7 mana, you drop 2 of these, they've been buffed up, it's 2 6/6s, and that seems pretty good. So you don't really want these big clunky minions in Kara late game, so just having a 3 mana threat that can keep getting buffed up, you don't mind having it in your hand for a little bit longer, that definitely seems like some synergy. And even just decks that are unlikely to attack your opponent early, something like Siva may want to play this, even though there's no more synergy apart from the fact that you have quite a defensive deck. What else might want to see play? Maybe even Spellhigh could play this. Spellhigh never really... Well, a lot of the time you don't get too far ahead in the early game. As a Spellhigh player, and a Songhigh player myself in general, for the most part, this card does scare me quite a lot, especially if it gets in the thing, because well, maybe I'm overrating that a little bit, because we don't actually tend to attack that often early on, but that's kind of what Songhai needs to be doing, is damaging your opponent's general. So it's definitely a threat in the later turns, but I think in the early turns when you're proccing it, it normally means you're actually ahead, which is not that common for Songhai. Like, first few turns we normally pass. So this one could really go either way. It definitely has a lot of potential. 3 mana 5/5, and I think this one is mainly just going to come down to testing. I'm sure this will be tested quite a lot, and you just really need to be looking how often is this getting procced. It does shut off Blood Tears though, so if it has any place in the metagame, like turn 1 you just skip the Blood Tear opening game, it's not the end of the world, but it saves you damage. So just a slight nerf to Blood Tear, I guess. Anyway, that's enough of that one. Really hard to evaluate that one, but we will see how it goes. I do think it has some potential and probably will find a home, maybe in Kara. Though it doesn't have an opening gambit, so you kind of do want stuff that works out of hand and not just big stats. Alright, Blood Tora. This is an interesting one. I don't really think this card is very good. Like, I don't think it's that good at all. It dies the whole Goku, which is a big thing. The problem is, just most of the game, you just cannot play this card, which is just a massive problem. It's not that this card is bad for most of the game, or you can't play it till you get to 9 mana. A lot of the time you just can't play this card at all. It's a cool effect, very similar to Molten Giant in Hearthstone, and the idea is obviously that you get low and you can play these. I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit too hard on this card, because if you're in a situation where you can kind of get yourself low and then drop 2 of these, that's obviously a pretty good turn, but it's pretty situational, and I don't know, the last time, like, it just doesn't happen very often where you stick a big minion now, even still. And if it gets to be part of the meta, Hollow Gravekeeper is a real blowout, just because you've had this card sitting all game and then they just come and kill it, which is definitely a problem. And, like, when is this card good? It's good when you're on, like, is it good when you have 9 health? Like, I don't know if you would play a 9 mana 12/12 provoke. Once you're past that, yeah, it's alright. Like, if you can play this and something else in a turn, suddenly that's alright, or, and that kind of thing. So maybe it sees play in something like a Lionheart deck. It does a similar role to Grandmasters here, with a little bit more of an instant effect, and a bit less weak to Dispel. And you're already weak to Hollow Gravekeeper, so maybe that's where it is. Maybe in like a Zavran deck where you get low, and then you heal yourself up, and you play this in the same turn. So maybe there's a little bit of potential there, but I think for the most part this card won't see too much play. I could be wrong though. This is another one of these hard to evaluate cards. But just the fact that you have a card in your hand that you can't play for most of the game, and when you're that low, like, you probably just die anyway, which is a real problem. Against like Kara, they just dispel it and chuck some tigers at your face because you're very low. Against Spellhigh, obviously they don't care at all. So I guess maybe against even like aggro Varth, like, it's not that good against, because they have Eggmorph, which is just a real blowout when you're relying on this card, and it takes so much to set up. Obviously all minions are weak to the, well, that's not even true, but you know, all minions are weak to removal to an extent, but this one, like, you have to put so much into it, like so much setup, sitting there for so long just to get it to go off that I don't think it'll see that much play. But maybe Zaran, we'll be able to use it a little bit. We'll see. Oh, that's the wrong thing to move. It is really annoying. Can't get the individual card files at the moment, so production quality is not the best, but we'll do what we can. So on to our legendary Ruby Rifter. I think this card's pretty good. I'm just going to put that straight out there. It's a 6 mana, 4/6 that whenever your general takes damage, give this minion 2 attack and draw a card. Like, that seems really good. Let's compare this to Scientist. If Scientist is like a 6 mana, 6/6 that draws a card when you have something you can target it, so like a Bloodborne spell. So most of the time it's like a 7 mana, 6/6 draw a card. And then there's Arcane Synergy, but that's a little bit win more almost, where you have an Owl Beast Sage on your board and you can play a 6-drop. You're probably already pretty ahead. Whereas this card is just like really, really good. Like, you just play it on turn 6, you hit face, and you have a 6 mana 6/6 that already drew a card. So it's like already better than the average case scenario for Scientist. And then if your opponent wants to keep attacking you, well, you just draw more cards and this thing gets massive. So I think for the most part, like when decks can afford to play this card and it's not too slow, like it's really, really good. And the fact that it gains like 2 attack, I think this card will be fine if it just drew a card every time you general take damage. But really, really good card. I don't know if this is something like you would run like self-damaging kind of things. I think you would just run it because it's a good card when you need late game card draw. So what kind of decks does this actually fit in though? Because it's arguably a little bit slow for aggro, maybe not. Just because aggro can often afford to always be hitting them in the face late game, whereas sometimes control, you just want to avoid all the damage you can, which is definitely a real downside. So maybe something like aggro Varth, where you want to be in the face hitting with the general anyway, is definitely a factor. But even worst case scenario, when you're behind, like you just play this, and then it discourages your opponent from hitting you. If they're like setting up a lethal, or they're not going to just kill you, it's very, very hard to ever attack in the general. So you can just play this safe. And if it just turns up being a 6 mana 6/6 that draws a card, I think that's pretty good for the most part. It will depend on the meta. Obviously, this is still a pretty slow card. Spending 6 mana just to draw cards and no immediate effect on the board is always going to be a little bit dangerous. But Scientist has seen some play, and I don't think the Arcane Synergy is just what makes Scientist good. So I do expect to see this card do pretty well and can help some late game decks. I think something like Control Magmar definitely wants this card, where you have healing so you can take that damage, get a ton of value, and you don't have card draw in Magmar. So something like that definitely stands out. Lionar's probably pretty fine with that as well. They're pretty happy to have the general in the middle of things, hitting things for the most part as well. So I do expect to see this card probably as a 2-of. A 3-of is probably a little bit too much still. But it may help shift towards control, because control's a little bit weak at the moment. One thing that I was talking about on the discard, Good actually mentioned that if you get to fatigue, the way this card reads, you just instantly lose the moment you get to fatigue. And we don't know how that's going to turn out. We'll have to see when this card comes out. But basically the reason is, when you get to fatigue, you take 2 damage for drawing the card. And then that will trigger your general taking damage, so you draw a card, and then it keeps going. And if you read it just on how the cards work, that's an instant kill on whoever's playing this card when you get to fatigue, which is pretty hilarious. But there's a very good chance that it doesn't actually end up working like that, because the coding has actually kind of stopped some of the infinite combos like Tegeti Staff and Sunriser, one of those, the healing cards, kind of stop those infinite combos. But the way the card reads, that is actually something. And I really do hope that it actually works like that, because it's maybe not impossible for Spell High to mill someone like this in some rare scenarios. Like, say they have like 20 cards left in the deck. If you can do like 20 ping damage, I don't know, it's a little bit of a stretch, but in some matchups, maybe this is a thing where you can just go for like fatigue and mill your opponent out. So very interesting card. I don't know if it's going to come with that much, but just an interesting thing to see if it actually does have a weakness to fatigue, because it will be pretty funny to just see someone play this card, get like, you know, double Blood Rage Mask, 4 Winds Magi, and then just mill them and then instant die and fatigue with a loop. But yeah, once again, good chance that it doesn't actually end up happening. I do expect to see this card see play. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Actually, this might be pretty good in Kara as well, because it's kind of a little bit understated. So maybe another card for slow Kara, which is kind of something that definitely has more potential with these cards. I think this card, slow Kara, might be more of a thing, and just control in general. So a very anti-aggro kind of set of cards here. Very interesting, very hard to evaluate cards for sure. So let us know your thoughts on in the comments. Any feedback you have for the channel, of course, and I'll see you next time, guys.